So hello everybody, my name is Kate Wakelin and I'm coming to you from NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia, where I am the NET patient support nurse. I would like to welcome everybody who's joined us this evening, and particularly our guest presenter, Erin Laing, who we will introduce in just a moment. But just before I continue, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am broadcasting to you all from, which is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would just like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. One of the things I really love about the Wurundjeri land that I live on is that it's very close to the Yarra River, where I love to go running. And in the Woiwurrung language, that's called the Birrarung. So when I go running along the Yarra River, I feel very grateful for where I am. And I know that people are joining us from all over Australia and even internationally this evening. So welcome to you all. And I would just love to extend that acknowledgement of country to wherever you are joining us from. So just a couple of little housekeeping things this evening. This webinar will last an hour. We are recording it, so if you can't watch the whole thing, or if you need to come back and recap some of the information, we will be loading it up onto our YouTube channel over the next couple of days. So we'll send a link out to everybody who has registered for the webinar. So if you can't stay for the whole thing, don't worry, you will be able to catch up on it later. Just the other thing is that we'll be presenting lots of general information this evening and some really exciting research about nutrition and NETs, but like anything to do with cancer and cancer treatment, it's a very individual situation, and we'll be just giving general information only for your own healthcare advice. Of course, here comes the general disclaimer, which is please talk to your treatment team, and we'll be giving some information at the end of the webinar about some resources and ways that you can get more information for your situation if you feel like you're a bit stuck. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Erin. Just before, so beg your pardon, one more thing before we keep going. There is a Q&A box. So a few people have actually emailed questions in. We've got some questions to start with after Erin's finished presenting, but if you've got questions that come up for you along the way, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A box. There is also a chat box, but if you could keep your questions to the Q&A box, that will help my end of Monday brain to navigate everybody's input. So if you can use the Q&A box, that's great. Before we, I'm going to introduce Erin, and then I've got a couple of questions for you to start off. So Erin is a senior dietitian at Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre here in Melbourne, and she works closely with the multidisciplinary team in the upper gastrointestinal and neuroendocrine units at Peter Mac, with a particular interest in the nutritional management and supportive care of gastrointestinal cancers, including neuroendocrine tumours, as well as nutritional issues and quality of life throughout cancer treatment. Erin is regularly involved in the allied health research and recently completed her PhD at the University of Melbourne. This research involved coordinating a multi-site research project at Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre and Austin Health, exploring the nutrition-related symptoms, complications and quality of life in patients with gastrointestinal, I'm having trouble with that word tonight, gastrointestinal neuroendocrine tumours, and the title of the study was called Nutrition in NETs. So thank you and welcome, Erin. I'm going to launch a little bit of a poll, so hopefully on everybody's screens you will see some questions for people, and the questions are: have you made any changes to your diet due to your NET diagnosis? And if you're logging in as a carer of someone with NETs, then answer it on behalf of the person that you're caring with. So the questions were, have you made any changes? What sort of changes have you made? Where have you gained information about diet in relation to NETs? And it'll be really interesting to see the results of these. I'm hoping that people will be able to see the questions, because it looks like it's live on my screen, and I can see actually there's people starting to, I can see the answers flowing through. So we'll give everybody a minute to answer those questions. I can see a variety of changes that people look like they've made, and certainly significant numbers of people look like they have made a change, which I know, Erin, you actually looked at this question in your research, so it'll be interesting to see how this correlates with your questions that you asked in your research, but looking at the sorts of changes that people have made. I've got 82% of people who are attending tonight making changes. I've got a reduced amines. A lot of people have reduced fat. A lot of, so 64% of people have reduced fat. Nearly half of the people who are watching have reduced dairy. About a third of people, over a third of people have reduced gluten. Quite a lot of people, significant number of people have reduced coffee. Over half have reduced alcohol. And then there's other changes that people have made as well. It looks like less than half people have had a chance to talk to their doctor. Oh, sorry, beg your pardon, to their dietitian. So about 36% have talked to a dietitian, 14% have talked about their dietary changes with their doctor. So I know this is something that you're going to be talking to us about, Erin, but also that there's been other health professionals I can see. About 13% have talked to another health professional. Lots of people, about a third of people have talked to other patients. Quite a lot of people have talked to the internet or consulted Dr. Google, and a lot of people have also talked to a family member. And pleasingly, about 63% of people have looked at the NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia resources, which is really exciting, and I'm very pleased. You get 10 marks on that one. So I'm going to finish that poll. And the other question I just wanted to quickly ask was, if I can find it again, is just if you could just tell us where you're joining in from, and we'll get you to just put in your state if that's okay. I know that some of you may have dialed in from overseas, and there's a somewhere else down the bottom of the list for you guys. So maybe we'll let that run for a second, and I'm going to introduce Erin. Erin, it's so wonderful to have you join us. I know this has been an incredibly busy year for you with the completion of your PhD and some other exciting projects on the sidelines, which maybe we'll talk about at the end. But yeah, so welcome. I'm going to hand over to you and get you to tell us all about your research. And I'm just going to look at those poll results before I turn my camera off. And it looks like, yeah, Victoria and New South Wales are a bit dominated, which is not surprising, but a reasonable amount of people from South Australia and WA. Maybe Tassie didn't get the memo because they've missed out, and quite a few people from somewhere else too. So that's really great. So thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn off my camera and I'm going to let Erin take the floor. And the classic 2020 quote for the year is, Erin, you're on mute. There you go. You're right now.
Got it sorted. Okay. Hi, everyone. And thank you for tuning in today. And thank you very much to NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia for inviting me to speak for this webinar about nutrition, which I know is a topic of interest to so many patients out there with neuroendocrine tumours. As Kate mentioned, I've finished my PhD. So I'm going to be talking heavily about a lot of the results and sort of what I explored in terms of what's happening with nutrition and NETs, and hopefully you find that interesting and we can sort of chat about some questions at the end. So I'll just share my screen and get my slides up. All right. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging a lot of people that obviously have contributed to the research I'm going to talk about today. Certainly my supervisors, Mai, Nicole and Michael, who have supported me throughout my PhD, and also my advisory committee, and then further associate investigator, Neil from Austin Health, and statistical support from Peter Mack through Carla and Alison, and also several sources of funding that have enabled a lot of the research I'm going to talk about today to be undertaken. So what I'm going to talk about today, so I'm going to update everyone on where the current published research is in nutrition and NETs. So you have a bit of an idea of what the background is about what we actually know in terms of literature and what's been published. But then I'm going to talk about my PhD research, which is starting to go through the sort of publication phase. So we'll be out there hopefully in the next 12 months. But a lot of the results that I found, which really contributes to some of those gaps in literature that we've got at the moment for neuroendocrine tumours and nutrition. So that included a longitudinal, so that's a study over time. So it was a period of 6 months of people diagnosed with a NET from Austin Health and Peter Mack. And then a series of interviews I did with patients about their diet and quality of life. And then explored the knowledge in regards to nutrition and practices of NET health professionals. So that was through an international survey of health professionals that had experience in NETs and focus groups. And then I'm going to talk a bit about what does all this data mean for future education and research in the nutrition space. So I published a literature review earlier this year on the nutritional complications and where we're at in terms of what we know about nutrition and NETs, particularly focusing on gastroenteropancreatic NETs. So they're the GI located NETs in the small bowel, pancreas and colon. So I'm just going to go through a few of these results now. So what some studies have shown is there are lots of different nutrition related symptoms that patients with NETs experience as a result of their disease or their treatment types. And as you can see, the majority of tumours that were involved here were gastrointestinal pancreatic NETs or carcinoid tumours, a lot with carcinoid syndrome, things like diarrhea, steatorrhea, which is the presence of fat and oily pale stool, fatigue. Food intolerances has only been looked at by one study, but had quite a high proportion of patients reporting that. Flushing, abdominal cramps, and weight loss and appetite, which again haven't been very well researched. So really we need a lot more information on those topics of interest. Now this is a busy slide, but this is also taken from the literature review. I guess it's essentially looking at the range of different factors that actually impact on nutrition in NETs. So essentially you got the presence of a tumour which causes problems with nutrition. Then you've got where the tumour is located. In a gut related NET, obviously you've got the location of the gut and that causing problems. But what I wanted to draw everyone's attention to, we'll go back, is this hormone secretion. So for patients that have a functional NET, so one that produces hormones that actually cause symptoms that they experience, depending what type of hormone that's actually produced. So for example, for a carcinoid or carcinoid syndrome tumour, it's serotonin. Insulinomas produce excess insulin, gastrinomas produce excess gastrin. You can see the range of different symptoms that we expect patients to experience that can actually have impacts on their nutrition. So I guess the point really here is the complexity of all the different impacts of nutrition in the presence of a neuroendocrine tumour. And I guess as health professionals, we really need to keep all of these things in mind when we're helping to manage each patient. So in terms of what else the literature has told us so far, is there's only a couple of studies cross-sectional, meaning they just looked at a snapshot of what was happening in terms of malnutrition in mostly lower grade NETs of grade 1 and 2, and that anywhere from 14 up to almost 40% were at risk of malnutrition, and approximately a quarter were malnourished. So a quarter is still quite a high proportion of patients in the total NET population that were deemed to be malnourished. Then vitamin deficiencies, some studies have looked at this, again, a little snapshot, quite small sample size, but up to anywhere 45% were shown to have a niacin deficiency, particularly patients with serotonin producing NETs or those with carcinoid syndrome, and patients on long-term treatment with somatostatin analogues, so things like lanreotide, octreotide, were found to possibly have fat-soluble vitamin deficiency, more so if they're having them long-term. Just to explain why niacin is at risk of being deficient in patients with carcinoid syndrome. So in someone without a NET, with this dotted line, tryptophan, which is an essential amino acid in our diet, and we get it through eating lots of different types of proteins. If you don't have a NET, a very small amount of it's used to produce serotonin for normal bodily function, which are listed here. And then quite a large percent's used to actually convert to niacin, which assists with energy metabolism mostly in the body. When you've got a present of a NET that hypersecretes serotonin and produces a lot of it, it actually gets preferentially converted to serotonin rather than niacin, and that's therefore what leads to reduced niacin stores and deficiency, of which in severe cases you get these sort of symptoms as well. So what do we know in terms of quality of life and diet so far? So from a really large study that was done of almost 2,000 NET patients in multiple countries, was that over 70% reported that NET diagnosis had a negative impact on their personal life. And about 58% reported making a dietary change as a result of their NET. And it's been really interesting to see that poll that Kate spoke about earlier, which sort of resonates with those numbers as well. Dietary change, really few studies have looked at this, but I'll talk about my PhD results, which add to this further. But patients with mid-gut NET in a small study avoided things like fermentable carbohydrates, fatty foods, And this is because they were associated with other symptoms like diarrhea and flatulence. But we've got really limited evidence at this stage as to what are the precursors to dietary change and the impact of this change amongst people with a NET. We also know that these symptoms can be quite debilitating, and that's really important, and it means they're important to address. So things like fatigue, diarrhea and flushing have the greatest impact on quality of life, and evidence has shown that there's associated distress, and often these gastrointestinal related symptoms are misdiagnosed as other conditions, IBS, food intolerances, when actually they're related heavily to a neuroendocrine tumour, and the management therefore needs to be adjusted. We also don't have any NET specific dietary guidelines at the moment, which is a problem because health professionals don't have specific guidelines for NETs to refer to. There's only very general cancer guidelines. So really what we need is something that's NET specific to make sure that everyone's getting the same type of care and evidence-based care for the neuroendocrine tumour. So that's what we know so far in terms of the literature. So on to what my PhD involved, and I'll talk through all the results. So the point of my PhD was really to provide a comprehensive description of the impact of GEP-NET, so GEP-NETs being those gastrointestinal located NETs, and their treatment on patients' nutritional status and quality of life, and to generate some evidence to inform future research and also evidence-based guidelines, which are hopefully close to being established at some stage in the future. It was broken down into a couple of phases. So the first phase was looking at observing patients over time, so over a period of 6 months, to look at their nutrition issues that occurred, their quality of life. So we looked at malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies, prevalence of symptoms, anxiety and depression, and patient-reported dietary habits. In terms of what it involved, so as I said, it was 6 months. Patients were recruited from 2 hospitals, so primarily Peter Mac, but also Austin Health. They're all adult patients, confirmed diagnosis of a gastrointestinal NET early in their referral to these sites, and for active medical treatment. So patients who were asymptomatic or observed only were excluded. This is a busy slide, but essentially it summarises all the different types of nutrition-related data that was collected on patients every 2 months over a period of 6 months. So we looked at things like vitamins, quality of life, symptoms, medications, their nutritional status, so presence of malnutrition, dietitian contact if they saw a dietitian at all, dietary habits, and then we did a series of patient interviews, which I'll talk about on a subset of patients in this group. So just to highlight that a lot of patients were assessed to be eligible for the study, but were unable to be recruited for several reasons, mostly because they were ineligible. 61 were recruited, but then over the course of the study, being a over time longitudinal study, we had some lost to follow up with patients, or some patients passed away during the study period, but fairly good attrition over the study period. So we started with 59, and just to let you know, some of the data that you'll be seeing relates to this many patients across the treatment. So we looked at data at baseline, 2 months later, 4 months later, and then 6 months later. In terms of the types of patients in this observational study, they varied, and look, that's really representative of the neuroendocrine tumour population. There's varying types of grades that present for NETs, of which we captured here, varying different sites of disease as well. Some had GI site but not defined. Majority had a small intestinal pancreatic NET, and treatment received. So some patients have had treatment at other localised hospitals prior to attending these specialist sites, so have different types of treatments received. And interestingly, length of time experiencing symptoms also varied a lot between patients, but majority reported experiencing symptoms for at least a couple of years prior to when they were recruited to the study, and time from diagnosis was mostly within 6 months. So this is a lot of information, and I guess we used a validated tool to measure health-related quality of life amongst patients. So we looked at sort of global health status, and then their different functioning states, and some symptoms were captured on this scale as well. But to draw your attention to some of the most important things, I guess what we found was global health status and some general things such as physical role, emotional functioning. So that's in terms of ability to do day-to-day activities, role in amongst family and social circles, their emotional function were lower than the general Australian population when you compare results to that. And also what we saw with people too was things like social function, which is also down here, actually reduced over time. So people found that their impacts of their neuroendocrine tumour got worse as time went on, on their social function. So that's ability to eat out, socializing with family and friends. So that was really interesting to see, and probably one of the major results. But things like endocrine, so this is symptoms of flushing related to a NET, actually improved. So symptoms overall showed some improvement over time. So despite that though, social function was still declining. So I think that's really important to note. In terms of the symptoms we observed amongst patients, so feeling tired or fatigued was the most common symptom reported by patients and remained important to them, and prevalent over the 6-month period, and was the highest in intensity by the end of the study. Most of the other symptoms, so abdominal discomfort, pain, bloating, wind, gas, etc., were all common at the start, but actually improved over time. Particularly things like bloating and abdominal discomfort had the biggest improvement over the 6-month period, and we would assume that's related to receiving specialist treatment for a NET and improving symptom-wise. Difficulties eating was pretty much stable throughout the study period, so that was interesting. So we assessed nutritional status. So because there's been really limited evidence about the presence of malnutrition, which is only one aspect of nutrition in neuroendocrine tumours, but it's one that's really important to address. So the presence of weight loss, change in body composition, so loss of muscle mass and associated low appetite, poor food intake, needs to be addressed when this is occurring. So we looked at how many patients were assessed as malnourished over the period. So at baseline, similar to the other literature, it's almost 30%. And it did decline over time to about 13%. And we saw a couple of reasons for this. So there were a series of patients that underwent surgery or PRT treatment that actually had improved nutritional status over time. We don't have enough data to say this improves nutritional status, these treatments, but it may indicate that these treatments are less likely to worsen someone's nutritional status, which is good. And there were a series of malnourished participants at the start who actually unfortunately died during the study, or received palliative treatment and didn't return to the hospital site, that therefore dropped out in numbers. So that could be another explanation as to why our numbers dropped. And commonly these patients underwent chemo, so it may indicate that chemotherapy is associated with poorer nutritional outcomes. If we looked we didn't have a lot of numbers to do this, but if we looked at the different types of NETs, so patients with grade 2 NETs over the 6-month period had an improvement in nutritional status, so less were malnourished by 6 months, which is great. And also with pancreatic NETs, we found that we went from 30% to 6%, so also improved. So that could again be reflective of the types of treatments that some of these NETs are receiving. So we did look at vitamin testing, but we probably didn't have huge numbers to look at to find significant results here. And I wanted to draw attention to the proportion of patients that underwent some of the vitamin testing. So we actually had relatively low acceptance of niacin testing, because that involved a 24-hour urine sample. So only 40% performed it at baseline and 30% at 6 months. And just the process of having to collect urine over 24 hours and return the sample to the hospital proved a bit of a problem. So it's not an ideal test to perform, unfortunately. But a lot of the other vitamins we were able to do easily through a blood test. We did, however, not find great results. I mean, vitamin D was sitting at 28 to 33% over the study period, but that's probably not too dissimilar from the general healthy population, where vitamin deficiency rates sit at about 25%. And niacin, there was a couple of patients who were deficient at baseline, but they're not towards the end. But that's only of the small sample that we tested. We've probably got enough evidence to say that patients with carcinoid syndrome or serotonin producing NETs may need to take a niacin supplement. So keep that in mind. But we probably do need more literature really to explore this association further. And in terms of fat soluble vitamins, patients on long-term somatostatin analogues or who've had major gastrointestinal surgery, who've got steatorrhea, so that sort of fatty, pale appearance of the stool may be at risk of these deficiencies. So keeping that in mind as well. So we looked at weight change over time. And in terms of proportions of patients, so there was still a high proportion that actually gained weight over the study period. So that can be another sort of end of the spectrum in terms of nutritional complications. Some patients don't like continually gaining weight over time, but it often was reflective of a positive response to their NET treatment. But there was also quite high numbers of patients that lost weight. So as you can see, it ranged from 44 up to 48% over the 6-month study period. And we looked at what we would call significant amounts of weight loss. So, more than 10% of body weight. So there certainly were patients that lost large amounts of weight, even after receiving neuroendocrine treatment. If we look at the degree of weight loss over the period too, by 6 months, the average percent of body weight loss was almost 5%, which is fairly significant. And the range, there were some patients that lost anywhere up to 20% of their body weight. So that was really interesting to observe. In terms of fat-free mass, so we measured patients' body composition. And so this is looking at the changes in lean body mass. So any changes in muscle mass that's observed, not just total weight change. And quite a high proportion had loss of fat-free mass over the period, almost a quarter on average. We actually also found that approximately a quarter of patients by 6 months had overall stable weight, but had actually had underlying fat-free mass loss. And some of these patients were feeling well, they were asymptomatic, but actually had underlying muscle loss. So I think it's just something to flag that you may be feeling okay, not too symptomatic, not necessarily undergoing major NET treatment, but there's still a chance that you are deconditioning and losing muscle. So it's just something to keep aware of. Keep aware of, if your muscle stores feel like they're normal, if your strength is still as good as it was, those sorts of things are good to pick up. And certainly for health professionals thinking about assessing this in a valid way when seeing patients. In terms of what we saw with dietitian contact and dietary change, so you can see the prevalence of things like malnutrition and weight loss were really high, but contact with a dietitian wasn't really, and this is despite the fact that we have specialist neuroendocrine dietitian at Peter Mac, which is myself, and also Austin Health do have a dietitian associated with their upper gastrointestinal unit. So as you can see, the contact with the dietitian at baseline, so initial recruitment to the study, was a lot lower than the proportion of patients that were either assessed as malnourished or reporting dietary change. So this is really indicating under recognition of these issues, that they're not always prompting contact with a dietitian and that sort of individualised assessment and management, which is a problem. And we saw the same results for these across every time point. So by 6 months, even though malnutrition rates had dropped, the proportion of patients that was reporting a dietary change remained at over 50% for the whole 6-month period. So despite the fact that patients may be more well nourished, they're still making major changes to their diet, and potentially that's going unsupported by a dietitian. So one of the biggest results to come out of this is that we need to find ways to flag these patients with the dietitian or with their treating team, and to get the right dietary advice. So what dietary change did patients make over this period? So in terms of meal pattern types, so majority of patients, and the different colours are for the different time points. So baseline, 2 months, 4 months and 6 months. But consistently small meals and avoiding certain foods was what patients reported to be doing. As a result, they were also eating more and drinking more frequent. In terms of the types of foods that they were making, resonates a little bit with the poll that Kate did quickly at the start. So alcohol was the most reduced food or drink, followed by red meat, which is probably not an uncommon type of food to be reduced in a cancer population generally, but then milk, bread, nuts, yogurt, and then the list goes on. There was also a list of foods that we didn't specifically put in our survey, but we asked patients to add any other foods they avoided. And as you can see, the range of foods down here. So we've got spicy food, fatty food, high fibre food, garlic and onions are some of the FODMAP foods. Processed sugar, salt, which was more of a general healthy eating or to reduce cancer risk. High FODMAP foods, which is similar to the garlic onion, gluten, and then we've got some of your higher amine related foods like chocolate, avocado. So really interesting to see the variation in the types of dietary changes that patients are making. And I think this is an important finding, as it is to say, it's not clear cut that all patients are following a certain diet. People are doing lots of different things, and really the reason behind this and the support to make the right dietary changes is important. We also asked patients to tell us what symptoms actually impacted their diet. So the changes that they were making to their diet, was it led by symptoms? And a lot said yes. So I guess of patients who had a dietary change, a huge proportion said it was related to loss of appetite. Things like nausea, abdominal discomfort, bloating, diarrhea, wind, gas and pain. And these are symptoms that are very common amongst neuroendocrine cancer patients as well. So important to flag these symptoms, particularly amongst patients, but also health professionals. These are the ones that tend to lead to dietary change. So if they're present, it's always worth thinking about whether it's causing a dietary change or if there is an association there. So to summarise the patient information that we recorded through the research, it was a longitudinal exploration of quality of life and nutritional complications with GEP-NETs. We know that participants had worsening social function over time, and whilst we didn't explore this formally, there could be a relationship with diet there. So, you know, diet's very much a social aspect. We eat and drink with our family and friends, and, you know, cooking is part of a social activity that we sometimes do. So whether there's a relationship between the large numbers of patients making a dietary change and reduced social function potentially. High symptom burden was prevalent amongst patients. So fatigue, pain, abdominal discomfort. So knowing that these symptoms are common amongst NETs generally, but this population we studied, it was very similar. Weight and fat-free mass loss were occurring in quite a high proportion of patients, so over 40% of the population, and potentially more so than were formally assessed as malnourished. So there's potentially these kind of underlying, under-recognised issues with slow weight loss or deconditioning and loss of muscle that needs to be addressed. And also patients undergoing PRRT were the ones most likely to have improved nutritional status over time, which might reflect a good response to that type of treatment for some patients. More than half of patients are changing their diet as a result of their diagnosis. So for all of you listening today, you're not alone. Whilst there's really only been one other survey that's looked at this that's been published, it really resonates the same message. So many patients with a neuroendocrine tumour are changing their diet to manage their symptoms, and the type of dietary change is varying. So, you know, we really need to work more towards looking into what are the dietary changes, how we can give them more individualised and evidence-based advice to help them manage symptoms. So we further to this, the patient interviews that I mentioned that we conducted, and this was on a subset of patients involved in this observational study. So we really wanted to look at, does a diagnosis and treatment of a NET impact their quality of life? And then what nutrition needs and diet changes occur after a diagnosis, but also what intervention was received. So what wasn't recorded as part of the observational study was what sort of interventions they'd received. So it was really good to explore and talk this through with patients. So we collected and recruited patients to interviews that had reported making a dietary change, so knowing that they were able to sort of expand on the reasons for this a bit more. And just to give a bit of a snapshot about the types of patients that are involved in the interviews. So of the cohort of 59 that were involved in the bigger study, we took 11 patients for interviews, and their years post-diagnosis ranged a lot from 6 months to 18 years. We had a range of patients from Australia and New Zealand, and which we did in the observational study as well, because a lot of patients travelled from New Zealand to have PRRT treatment. So it was really good to get that picture of patients across the different countries as well. So on average, they were 56 years, but a big age range, anywhere from 29 up to 71. Differences in males and females. There was a range of grades and sites. So of the 11 patients that were involved in interviews, as you can see, the types of dietary changes were numerous and varied. So again, supporting what we've already found with our other observational research. And then in terms of what patients said about conflicting advice and self-management, so one of the biggest themes that came out of the interviews was patients felt the need to self-manage their diet a lot. So they had experienced symptoms, but they didn't feel well supported or had conflicting advice from health professionals, whether that's, you know, a neuroendocrine expert health professional, or if it was their local GP, or a smaller health service where they initially got diagnosed, and therefore often felt conflicted in terms of what they should do with their diet, and also a need to take on their own management of diet and sort of play around with things and what they're eating. So I've got some quotes here. So nutrition wise, one patient said, what I should and shouldn't eat, or what's best that I do or don't do, that's why I'm feeling a little bit in the air at the moment. Another patient said they went to a dietitian who was basically sitting there Googling possibilities while we were in the room. And this is a man talking about how he'd had a lot of IBS related symptoms that people had told him were just general gastrointestinal symptoms. I think it was bloating, wind, diarrhea. And so he just went to see a private dietitian that would have had no experience in NETs, and just sort of was sitting there Googling while he was there. And he appreciated that she didn't know much more of what to do, but felt like he wasn't well supported in that regard. I guess it's about NET specific advice that patients are after, and that's something that really came out strongly in these interviews. Another patient said she was a lovely young girl, meaning the dietitian. So she had a week or two to prepare for my visit and just said she didn't know what advice to offer me, and also gave me a printout on the FODMAP diet. So I think this is acknowledging, and one of the big themes that came out of the interviews was that patients saw a real difference between, private or local health professionals and their management of them and advice versus what they might get from a centre that sees a lot of NETs and has a lot of experience in neuroendocrine tumours and maybe has a dietitian that more specialises in cancer or NETs specifically. So there's a real difference that sometimes just seeing a general clinician is not enough NET specific advice for them, because really NETs, as we know, are very unique and need their own advice. Another patient said, I've just been self-helping, and as I said, looked up these discussion boards, and they'll talk about what sets them off worse, and I sort of take on board and stop having that. So that's really getting advice from their fellow peers and other patients about what foods that they should try and avoid, and taking advice from what others have experienced in a similar situation. So it was a really complex context that we saw. So patients had complex information needs, but they weren't always met. They needed individualised nutrition assessment and education, but weren't always receiving that, particularly from generalist health professionals. They described a lot of quality of life impacts of their neuroendocrine tumours, so on work, family, social activities, and financial impacts. And many of these related to diet as well. So the key themes were uncertainty. So a lot of patients didn't know how long they would be living for with this neuroendocrine tumour and the burden of symptoms. So they were quite desperate to find ways to improve their quality of life as a result, in case they'd be dealing with these symptoms for many years to come. The advice from health professionals, particularly those with less experience in NETs, was conflicting, and definitely self-management and seeking information from peers rather than health professionals was quite common. That in a snapshot is what we found out from patients through this research. And I'm going to talk a bit about the health professional side of things, because when I designed my PhD, I thought, it's not just about what the patients experience, it's also about what the health professionals are actually, what they know about the situation, what they've observed, but also what advice and interventions they're providing to patients, which hasn't really been looked at before. So it's been really interesting to explore this. So the phase 2 of the research was to look at knowledge and management of nutritional complications in patients with GEP-NET. So again, focusing a lot on those gastrointestinal NETs, but some health professionals talk to NETs in general. So we wanted them to talk about their knowledge of complications related to nutrition, what their current management practices were of nutrition, and also to summarise current practices of clinicians in an international setting. So we did a structured online survey with 21 questions that looked at symptom prevalence, the impact on nutrition. They asked health professionals about nutrition screening and assessment, if they perform this, what evidence guidelines they use, and what type of nutrition advice they provide to patients. So we had 73 NET health professionals from around the world complete the survey, mostly from Australia, and a range of medical, so this is mostly medical oncologists, some gastroenterologists, and nuclear medicine physicians. Nurses and dietitians were probably the majority of the respondents. In terms of symptoms, so we asked them to tell us what symptoms they thought were most commonly reported to them by patients, what were most concerning, and the symptoms they felt led to reduced dietary intake in patients and with weight loss. And these probably ended up being quite similar to what we see from patients reporting, which is a really good thing. It means that the health professionals are reporting the same awareness of the same types of symptoms that are one common amongst NETs, but also impacting on diet too. So the most commonly reported to them by patients was diarrhea, fatigue, and abdominal discomfort. And then the symptoms that led to reduced dietary intake and weight loss were diarrhea, low appetite, and nausea. So that was really interesting. In terms of what they're actually doing, so we know that from the other study, only a 22% at most was seeing a dietitian. And what we found through surveying the health professionals was that less than half, not even about a third, were actually screening themselves for malnutrition. So this is sort of formally screening for it. And not many use validated tools. So validated tools meaning these are tools that we know through evidence that are very, very much sensitive to pick up changes in nutritional status amongst patients, and they're really recommended to use in cancer patients. Some said that a colleague did this screening, but again, there's a huge proportion that aren't formally screening for this issue. And in terms of vitamin screening and supplementation, again, a very similar proportion. So approximately a third, if not slightly more, was screening for vitamin deficiency. So we probably expected that to be higher, because again, the people that were filling in this survey were needing to claim to be relatively well versed in managing NETs, so that they'd managed NETs for at least 1 to 2 years. They see, at least 25 to 50 patients a year. So these are health professionals that regularly see NETs, but not many of them are formally screening for these nutrition issues. When asked about the vitamins, as you can see, if you look at dietitians, they sort of varied a lot, might have over the different types of vitamins screened a lot of different types, whereas nursing probably more looked at vitamin D, B12 and folate, same with medical. So they're probably your more common blood tests that might be performed in any cancer patient. So that was really interesting. So NICE and no doctors reported to screen for that. And then barriers to this. So we thought it was important to ask why health professionals aren't doing this on a regular basis. So a lot said it wasn't their role, or they refer to someone else. A lot said it was the dietitian's role. But the problem with that is if patients aren't referred to a dietitian, then they're not going to receive that screening in that case. And also being unsure what to screen or supplement. So many did report not being sure about the evidence for vitamin screening and supplementation in NET. So I think that's highlighting the need for these evidence-based guidelines for neuroendocrine tumours is really important. We asked them what type of nutrition advice they provided to patients on a regular basis, and symptom management was first and foremost the most common thing, which we would expect, because certainly symptoms of neuroendocrine tumours are not only debilitating to patients, but a huge factor in why many health professionals are helping to manage patients through treatment or otherwise. So other things like weight loss, dietitians, which are in the orange, really did most of the different types of advice, but as you went along to weight gain, food intolerance, vitamins, fewer and fewer medical and nursing staff reported to talk about these. When we asked them what guidelines they use, majority just use general cancer guidelines, or they use NET guidelines from ENETs, for example, but these don't have any nutrition specific information, so that was a problem. And a third reported a lack of NET specific nutrition guidelines as a barrier to their practice. So really highlighting the need for us to develop these as health professionals. In the focus groups, we really just got a bit more detail about why they did certain practices, what their opinion was in terms of the optimal nutritional management of NETs. And we looked at health professionals and involved that were working specifically at Peter Mac for these focus groups. In terms of the numbers, so we had about 13 health professionals with a range of different professions, so nurses, medical oncology, surgeons, nuclear medicine physicians, dietitian and endocrinologist. And we asked them to talk about what they felt the impact of nutrition was on NET patients. And they said mostly it helps them manage complex symptoms. So again, brought in that feeling that there's that relationship between diet and managing symptoms. And they were aware that a lot of patients were deliberately wanting to change their diet or talk about their diet to help manage their symptoms. Diarrhea came out as a really common symptom that health professionals thought needed proper management through diet, which is really interesting. So that might be indicating the need for specialised advice for diarrhea management, dietitian input, and maybe that needs to improve. A lot of health professionals did talk about that they observed patients restricting their diet to help manage symptoms. So that's a positive thing in that health professionals are aware of this happening, but whether they're actually asking patients about it and prompting that conversation to help support them in doing this potentially isn't happening. The experience of health professionals really depended on their role and stage of contact. So for example, surgeons often said, I'm seeing someone very early stages, and if I can resect the tumour, I don't talk too much about symptoms and quality of life. Whereas medical oncologists that tend to see patients for longer periods of time, have them on longer types of treatments like somatostatin analog injections or chemotherapy, said they sort of managed symptoms more longer term. Health professionals felt that small bowel NETs and those with carcinoid syndromes were most at risk of food intolerances. And also that patients on PRT may be less needing nutrition input, but that's only if they're responding to the treatment. In terms of one quote, one nurse said the restrictive diets are more of a perceived need for that diet rather than actually knowing what they need to do. So saying that patients perceive that they might need to change their diet, whereas potentially health professionals believe they may not need to. In terms of nutrition screening, we asked them about these behaviours and why they did certain things. So they said that they perceived malnutrition and weight loss to be less common amongst neuroendocrine tumours than some other cancer types, particularly other gastrointestinal cancers like esophageal cancer and stomach cancer. That malnutrition wasn't as high priority as symptom management, so they were therefore less likely to screen for it. And they also have no guidance on a systematic, so a sort of procedural way to measure malnutrition amongst patients. So therefore they just generally ask questions and probably don't do it as routine practice, but time and lack of evidence was a barrier. So something for us health professionals to keep in mind when we're looking at developing future guidelines and further research to help patients in this space. If a dietitian was available in their centre, there was less need for nursing and medical teams to screen for issues or to give advice. That was really interesting. So that's putting a lot of onus on the dietitian to be managing these issues, which I completely agree is our role as a dietitian, but we've got to make sure the referrals are coming through to give patients that chance to have contact with a dietitian and one with knowledge in NETs. So one endocrinologist said we probably need some evidence base in terms of what to screen, what test, how often, what's the outcome, what's the gain. And another person said we don't have the evidence, that's the problem, and that's a barrier to some of the nutrition related advice they give to patients. So most gave general advice on eating well and avoiding restrictions. They acknowledged that some symptoms prompt nutrition advice. So if patients had really bad diarrhea, that might prompt them to give some advice or refer to the dietitian. Time again was brought up as a barrier, and a dietitian considered the best source of nutrition information. In terms of finding information, a lot of them observed patients wanting to seek general advice on what they could do to control. And I guess diet is a big aspect in nutrition of what patients can control, because, you know, if we eat every day, we control the types of foods that we eat. So it's very much important that they have control over that. So health professionals acknowledge that. That peer support and timely information was important, which I think is really great for health professionals to acknowledge, because that resonates amongst the patient interviews as well. And that patients generally are very proactive in searching for information, which I've observed too as a health professional. So it's nice that they're picking up on these things, that nutrition to patients is important. And one said it's a long-standing disease that people are quite keen to read stuff on and be proactive with, trying to find out whatever they can about nutrition related to their disease. So for me, it was positive to hear that health professionals were observing that nutrition is important to patients, but I think we have to spread the word about this even more. So to summarise, what we found through all this data is that nutritional complications are prevalent, but they're definitely under-recognised. So the same proportion of patients that are making dietary change, that are malnourished, losing weight and not seeing dietitians, or are not getting specialist nutrition advice that's related to their NET. This is a problem because we know that neuroendocrine tumours have impacts on quality of life, social function and nutritional status. A lot of the dietary change occurring is patient-directed, which has its positives. So, you know, patients are being really proactive in doing this, but we want to make sure that the dietary changes that are occurring are, one, necessary. So it would be really horrible for people to be cutting out foods in their diet that are actually unnecessary and restrictive, because there were patients did report through the interviews that they felt they couldn't eat out because of how restrictive their diet was, and it did impact their quality of life. So I guess as health professionals, our role is really to make sure that patients, if they're making changes, they're necessary and they're appropriate for them. So symptom burden, really important factor in all this, and particular symptoms like diarrhea, abdominal discomfort, bloating and pain were first and foremost the most spoken about. Screening is not routine despite all of this, so we need to address that amongst health professionals, and the dietitians really relied on for this type of advice. We've got to make sure dietitians, not just those in specialist centres, but dietitians in the private setting and in all other hospitals, are really given more education about the best way to manage nutrition when they come across a patient with a NET. We know that lack of evidence is a problem, and we certainly need to contribute to that. Hopefully publication of some of these results will help with that, and further research that's to come. So what other implications have we got? So this is really the first longitudinal or over time comprehensive exploration of nutrition in NET. So it's really great that this has been able to happen. And the first summary of what nutrition related practices are occurring amongst health professionals as well, which has been really good. So we really need to develop some NET specific nutrition guidelines. And I'm sure NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia will let everyone know about those as soon as they're in the works and available, but really to guide health professionals and make sure the advice they're giving patients is the most important, appropriate, but also consistent amongst different health professionals, and that it focuses on what symptom burden is occurring and what dietary impact and changes need to happen. I keep saying to health professionals, nutrition is of interest to patients and it really needs to be a priority. So when we talk about health, supportive care, it's not just about, mental health and exercise and other aspects. Nutrition is also very, very important to patients, and that's resonated through the results. So we need further research looking at dietary changes. Do amine foods or do high fibre or high fatty foods have a direct link to symptoms? I think further research on these specific aspects will really give us that information that can help us guide practice and help patients and look at the relationship between symptoms and diet generally. And like I said, we need to target education of NET experts, but also, GPs, dietitians in the private setting on nutrition risk and NETs, things to look out for, specific information they can provide and resources that they can give to patients as well. So that's my last slide, and I guess I just wanted to draw your attention. I'm sure Kate will talk to this too, some resources that are currently available on NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia website. So whilst I didn't talk specifically about practical strategies in terms of dietary management, and I've done that before for other talks, but essentially I've collaborated on some of these booklets, so the nutrition and NETs and also diet booklet, and there's one on diarrhea, there's one on vitamins that you can get through the NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia website. All the information we've got through the evidence we've put into actually practical booklets for patients. So if you haven't accessed them already, that's your best source of information before obviously you get individualized information from a dietitian. And there's a food and symptom diary that I recommend to so many patients, is really helpful to, if you're not sure if there's a certain food that's affecting how you're eating, first and foremost, start a food and symptom diary for at least 2 to 3 weeks. And there's a blank version of one on the website you can download. Hopefully you find helpful, because it helps to really pinpoint whether there's any particular foods that lead to symptoms, and a really nice starting point, and take that to your doctor or dietitian for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. And can I just say on behalf of everybody, congratulations on such amazing comprehensive research. And it's, from my point of view as a nurse, it's really heartening to see us focusing, importantly on making tumours shrink and getting people to live longer with NETs and to cure more people with NETs, but really importantly, when we're allowing people to live a longer life with their tumour, or have reductions in tumours, we want them to be feeling well and getting the most out of that time and that life. So I think that your research is really going to help us as health professionals, help our patients as well. So it's fantastic research. We do have time for just a few questions, and there's been a lot of questions. There were quite a few that were emailed in ahead of time, and then I can see in the questions and answers box that everyone's been really busy with those too. So let's see how we go. One thing I will plug up front is that Erin has very kindly offered to join us in our Facebook private discussion group. Every Friday we do a live broadcast session, and often we have a guest expert, and Erin very kindly has offered to join us on Friday for that. So any questions that we don't manage to answer today, we will definitely save them for that Friday chat, and that also goes into our YouTube channel. So if we don't get to your question tonight, don't worry. The other thing I would just say about the YouTube channel and is that Erin's previous talks are also on that channel as well. So we'll make sure we email everybody a link to that channel when this one's up and available. But have a look in that channel, because there's other really relevant nutrition videos that are very much focused on tips and strategies for managing with NETs. So the question I had first was just a really simple one, hopefully, and it was, what year was this study done?
Good question. I think we started recruiting in 2017, and I think most of the data was collected by 2018 from memory. I went on maternity leave for a period of time, so there was a delay in getting some of the results all finalised, but it's all done now. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got a few questions, a few sort of more detailed questions that patients emailed me. And just to reiterate our earlier little disclaimer to say that unfortunately we can't give individualised advice, but also knowing that the issues that patients emailed about and have typed on the screen are actually common to lots of people with NET. So we'll attempt to give some sort of general answers. The first one, the person was talking about poor sleep since surgery. We don't know what sort of surgery this person had had, but they're waking up really early, like they've got jet lag. And the question was, are there any dietary changes that might be able to help with this?
Not specifically, I have to say. We don't sort of deal with insomnia. I mean, insomnia actually came up as a common symptom through some of the surveys we did with the patients in the observational study. But whether there's a dietary link, we've got no evidence for that, I guess, to answer in that regard. But in terms of my practice with patients, no, look, not necessarily. I occasionally have patients wake up hungry during the night, which obviously it makes sense, you know, try to eat as much as you can before bed. But no, to actually address insomnia, I'm afraid to say there's nothing we can specifically manage dietary wise. I would suspect it's a general side effect of any treatment that you're undergoing that's leading to insomnia generally. Yeah.
So maybe that's back to the drawing board and the doctor with that one, but
yeah.
Thank you for that one. The next question is a person who has had their spleen removed and the person is on long-term antibiotics, and they were asking if there are any dietary changes that they should make because of this and to improve their gut health. And there's a related question that actually I can see our very own dear Simone Layden has put in the question box, which is related. So she said, you know, great presentation, but do you think there's future studies, you know, there's a potential for future studies in microbiome testing and studying in relation to treatment? So there's sort of two related questions around microbiome and the first person being on antibiotics, but also the question about whether there's broader research that's warranted in this area.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. I think microbiome testing's become more and more popular, well known, thought about certainly the last couple of years. And gastroenterologists particularly are thinking more about it. And I think given a lot of the neuroendocrine symptoms are, you know, things like diarrhea, wind, bloating, they're gastrointestinal symptoms that are very much related to your gut function and status. And certainly things like bloating, wind, diarrhea can sometimes be indicative of an imbalance in the microbiome in the gut. So we can make assumptions that there's an imbalance and sort of try to manage it through, you know, that's why often a low FODMAP diet's used, because that reduces sort of gas producing and those sorts of things. But there are ways to get specific tests for each individual. That's really the only way to know whether you specifically have a problem or an imbalance and how best to treat that, because there's certainly, I get asked a lot about whether I should take prebiotics, probiotics, those sorts of things. Prebiotics being foods that are naturally fermented, you know, or kombucha, things like that. So yes, unless you're heavily immune compromised, you know, having chemo or other treatments, then yes, that's absolutely fine and healthy to do that, and it may help. And then probiotics being actually live cultures of bacteria, for that good bacteria that's meant to sort of rebuild the good bacteria in your gut, because often that imbalance is you've got a lot of bad bacteria in your gut, but not so much good bacteria, which is what we want. So yeah, look, I think generally, yes, it probably is related to NETs. We've got very little evidence for it at the moment, but I think it's probably going to be an emerging area of research. So my best advice is, if you're worried about your microbiome or your gut health, you need to talk to either a gastroenterologist or a dietitian about what's best for you individually, because they'll look at your NET type, your treatment type, and your diet, because certainly, you know, the fiber sources in your diet can also impact on what might be happening in your gut.
Thank you. I know that we're not going to get through all of the questions that people have put in, so do stay tuned for the Facebook Friday follow-up. But I did have two, hopefully, brief questions for you, Erin. The first one is that your research really looked at gastrointestinal, so I can say the word now, gastrointestinal neuroendocrine tumours, but we know that lots of people have NETs that start in other areas of their body, and the one that I'm thinking of particularly lung NETs, where people do get carcinoid syndrome and a lot of those symptoms. How transferable are your findings to people with lung NETs?
So I can't say for sure, because we didn't recruit lung NETs in this study. However, from my knowledge of lung neuroendocrine tumours and how they present in terms of their carcinoid syndrome, I would say absolutely transferable. So any sort of information we've found through this research and the advice we'd give for someone with carcinoid syndrome with a gut NET or a small bowel NET, we'd say do a similar thing if you've got a lung NET. And the reason being, it's the high production of serotonin in both those types of NETs. So the hormone is similar. So therefore, yes, the advice should be fairly similar from what we know.
Yep. Fantastic. And there was just one question that I saw that might be a really quick one to answer, and I'm going to be sort of pushing the time envelope, but I'm sure people can hang in there with me. Just it was around the niacin or vitamin B3. That's only detectable via urine test and not a standard blood test. So that's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, blood tests are available for it, but they're not considered gold standard or kind of accurate enough. So 24-hour urine testing is the best available, and only a couple of centres in Australia do it. So we had to actually ship our samples off to New South Wales. So I tend to tell health professionals and patients, you know, if you're in that category of possibly at risk, which is if you've got really bad carcinoid syndrome, or your doctor said you've got a really high serotonin producing NET, I'd ask if you should just take a niacin supplement. The really good thing about niacin is it's water soluble, so you pee out any excess. So it's not something you can really get toxicity from by just taking a supplement from over the counter. Yeah.
And I know there's a question there about foods to eat for niacin, but maybe we'll talk about that on Friday, because I had one more question to ask you, Erin, and that is that, you know, for people, we gave the disclaimer at the very beginning of the webinar to talk to your own healthcare team, but we've also heard stories about, you know, people seeing dietitians and their dietitians not really, because NETs are so unique and individual that sometimes the dietitian that the person's referred to might not actually know that much. So what are we doing? What can we do to upskill dietitians in this area so that patients, regardless of where they are, can access someone who knows about this?
Yeah, look, it's a really, really good question, and it's certainly something that's on my mind to try and improve. I think, you know, upskill dietitians as best we can who don't probably see NETs as commonly as I do, but really need to know about them anyway. Look, I guess first and foremost, we need a guideline of some sort. So certainly, as you know, Kate, and so everyone's aware, COSA are developing an update of their guidelines, and we've got a nutrition and supportive care section that there will be some nutrition advice there. So that's a starting point, and hopefully other guideline groups follow suit. I think getting the research out there, I have been asked to speak to a couple of groups around Australia as well, which has been really great, different groups of dietitians at different health centres. So not that it's just up to me, but I think, you know, where we can have resources available, and as long as health professionals know where to access them, that's probably the most important thing. And certainly through NeuroEndocrine Cancer Australia is a great place to start in that regard. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, it's obviously a work in progress with so much of this, and congratulations once again for the research, which is really just giving us the evidence to set the ball in motion to get a lot of these things underway and to demonstrate the need for these sorts of things. So we're really excited that you're seeing this PhD through to completion. And just to plug, I know that you did give some screenshots, but all of the booklets that Erin talked about and the resources. So this is the Nutrition and Neuroendocrine Tumours booklet. We've also got the vitamin and minerals and NETs. These are all on our website. We've also got a tip sheet on managing diarrhea, which is a really important one for a lot of people with NETs. So there's some stuff around diet, but there's also some practical kind of considerations of just, you know, day-to-day life when you're experiencing that. You mentioned the COSA guidelines, Erin. So the Clinical Oncology Society of Australia are drawing together a reviewed version of the NET clinical practice guidelines, and we're really excited. Erin and I have been working together on a new chapter for those guidelines, which encompasses, so it's around supportive care, and it encompasses diet, encompasses exercise physiology, and also psychosocial aspects of living with NETs. And we're hoping that this will give some more good quality high level information for doctors and nurses and dietitians and clinicians out there in the world who are looking after people like you. So we're in the sort of the final draft stage of that. So I'm hoping that early next year, hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be able to make some announcements there. So there's lots of stuff on the website, but if people need more support and information, there's a couple of ways to go about it. The first way is you're always welcome to contact me. So I'm the NET patient support nurse and I'm available for people in Australia. The phone number for me is 1300 287 363. So that's 1300 287 363, and it's on the email signature. I sent out the emails to log into the webinar, so I'm pretty easy to find. Also, emails are great because that way I can really see what the nature of your question is. And so my email address is kate@neuroendocrine.org.au. Erin, you normally do telehealth consulting, but there's going to be a slight interruption to transmission. Is that right?
Yes, I said I already went on mat leave a couple of years ago, but I'm going on mat leave again shortly. So I'll be out of action in terms of telehealth and private work for the next few months, but I'm hoping towards the end of next year, I'll be back on track with that. And I'm happy to circulate that information through your website.
Fantastic. And congratulations, not only on gestating a PhD, but cooking a baby at the same time, which I think is extraordinary. We do have in Australia another NET specialist dietitian who's Kaylee Schneid, who's from Sydney, but she's able to consult via telehealth around Australia. And with one of the perks of COVID is actually that there's some rebates available for those consultations where they weren't before. So if you're in another state or another city, you're not in Sydney, you can still consult with Kaylee via telehealth, and she's available. Her details are on the website. So Erin, we'll make sure we let everybody know when you're back from maternity leave, and we just wanted to really wish you all the best for your baby and your family adjusting to another new little one. So once again, thank you so much. I know it's been an incredibly busy time for you and we so appreciate this. We're looking forward to having you back with us on Friday in the Facebook Friday in our private discussion group. I'm just looking at my list and making sure there's anything else I was going to say. People, when we finish this webinar, there'll be an evaluation for you at the end. So that should pop up on the final screen as I close this webinar. So please let us know your thoughts. We're constantly learning from people giving their feedback, so we're really keen to hear what you think. Erin, thank you. Thank you everyone for dialing in. We'll sign off now, and we'll look forward to making an exciting announcement soon. Take care all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.